Good morning, Dan and Amy. Remember who this is?
City, baby.
You know who sang it? One hit wonder.
Rock. I don't know. Wu Hong Tong.
What? The Whispers. The Whispers.
The Whispers.
Is the correct
What
answer.
I've been doing all week, whispering.
Yeah. All right. Our friend Zach Model, friend of the show, Burr Ridge Village trustee, also one of the executives at a multi-generational family manufacturing business out in Lyons, West Central Cook County, Atlas Toolworks. He was on Fox Business talking about the tariff man, self-described, and Trump's approach to China.
When profit doesn't matter to these companies and they have a government behind them helping them cheat and steal, how can we compete? We need to do it smarter. And what it comes down to is jobs. It's not just about high tech and innovation. It's about jobs. It's about national security. And all the employees like mine, you know, when I lost my telecom customers in the early 2000s, we had to lay people off. We reinvented ourselves, but a lot of other companies couldn't. Telecom and so many other sectors are really important. We're talking about good jobs for Americans versus growth and good jobs for people in China. I want to see it made here. And I want to see it secure and safe so we can trust what's going through our networks.
Now, Zach Model is a very smart guy and a successful businessman and Republican. And that opinion is a prevailing one in the era of Trump. There's no question about it. But it's a good economics. I mean, we've had these discussions on this show, and I don't agree with where Zach is going, and I don't agree with Trump's pronouncement of being a tariff man, and I don't agree that you look at economics through the eye of the state's interests. I'm looking at it through the eye of the consumer's interests, which is, I think, where most classical economists are, and what free market conservatives used to be. And Steve Moore, for example, we talk to regularly, is somewhere in between. But I want to take the arguments that are being made, because I think they're being made from a good place, as in the case of Zach Model, and address them. And to help us do that and engage you and our listening audience, we're pleased to be joined by Mark Perry. Mark Perry is a University of Michigan economics professor, and he is also the author and archivist and for Carpe Diem blog at the American Enterprise Institute. This is one of the best economic blogs on the internet. It's Carpe Diem, like Marginal Revolution. If you're interested in economic policy, thought-provoking articles and commentary, data to try to understand and think about, Carpe Diem is must-reading on a daily basis. It certainly is for me. Mark Perry, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, hi, Dan. Yeah, happy to be back.
So I want to have you address what Zach said. You know, here's a manufacturing proprietor here in the Chicagoland area saying, you know, generally speaking, I like what Trump's doing because I want Chicagoland and America to be the international center for manufacturing, for producing, for generating the wealth-creating jobs that are generating the manufacturing, not China.
Right. Well, I mean, that's where you were just mentioning that we should look at trade and all economic issues through the viewpoint of the consumer and not the producer. Producers always have a strong self-interest in reducing competition. In an ideal world for a producer, they'd like to be a monopolist and be the only producer in the industry. And so what they'll do is they'll invest resources and engage in what economists call rent-seeking, trying to limit the amount of competition. And one way to do that is through protectionism, because domestic firms don't really like to have to compete against foreign firms. And so when we think of protectionism, it's a form of crony capitalism, and it's legal plunder, and it's the producers trying to restrict competition, which makes them better off, their industry and their workers, but it puts the rest of the economy at risk, and it's a really bad deal then for the U.S. consumers.
Well, why shouldn't we try to restrict competition when the competition is unfair? Chinese-sponsored companies like Huawei and others in these spaces that are unfairly being provided support or insulation from competition with respect to American companies.
Well, we often think of the U.S. as this great free open economy, but we put a lot of restrictions on foreign trade. For example, for the last 50 years or more, we've had a 25% tariff on pickup trucks or any imported trucks coming into the country, and it's given Ford and GM kind of a monopoly or a duopoly on the pickup truck industry. We also don't allow any foreign sugar into the country, and so our sugar prices are twice the world price because of our prohibition on foreign sugar coming into the U.S. market. And then in terms of the subsidies, we subsidize our farmers. We have a lot of subsidies. We're subsidizing, Amazon to relocate to a new headquarters. So there's a lot of subsidies for U.S. companies. And then to the extent that foreign taxpayers are subsidizing foreign producers, we should welcome that. In fact, I had it on my blog the other day that we should send them chocolates and flowers and a thank you note and not condemn them, because what they're doing is making their products more affordable for U.S. consumers and U.S. companies. And so it's really like a gift of foreign aid. And so to whatever extent they're willing to subsidize their producers and lower prices for Americans, we should welcome that.
Speaking of condemnation, I found it very strange. On Wednesday, that our nation's focus was, of course, on the state funeral for George H.W. Bush. But during that same time, the CEO of General Motors, Mary Barra, she was on Capitol Hill, and lawmakers were trying to figure out a way to punish her for closing the sedan factories. And why is it the government's business how she structures her company?
Yeah, that's a great example of just unnecessary intrusion of politics into American commerce and American corporations. If what people maybe don't fully understand is General Motors operates as a global company. They're a multinational corporation. They produce all around the world. They sell all around the world. They invest around the world. They hire around the world. They're thinking of their company, as they should, through a global perspective and a global lens. And so to try to force them to think narrowly through this, Make America First, or this nationalist viewpoint is really damaging and is not a good way for us to approach our multinational corporations who are having to compete in an intensely competitive global environment with these global supply chains. And so she has every right, or General Motors has every right, to make the decisions that they have to make to survive. One thing is that General Motors now sells more cars in China than they sell in the United States. So maybe it makes sense for them to produce cars there instead of producing them here and shipping them over there. So again, I think General Motors is making the right decisions. They have to do that to survive in this intensely hyper-competitive global marketplace.
One of the things that's interesting is for people who otherwise are skeptical of the government's ability to effectively do much of anything, there is a sort of an assumption that if the government moves to protect an industry, it's going to do so in a productive way. And history suggests that's not the case. You had on your blog this week a couple of examples as well, that the industries that are ostensibly being protected by Trump's tariffs are not being protected any more than the auto industry was protected in the 70s, any more than industry was protected when the Smoot-Hawley tariff were passed at the outset of the Great Depression.
Yeah, and then we have to look at the benefits from protectionism are concentrated on a certain industry or a certain company. And so, for example, one study showed that because of the steel and aluminum tariffs, that's going to help support or create 33,000 jobs in the steel and aluminum producing industry. But because there's all of these companies that use steel and aluminum, including General Motors, which says that they have $1 billion increase in cost for the materials because of the tariffs. So now they're estimating that we're going to lose about 179,000 jobs throughout the rest of the U.S. economy for the companies that use steel and aluminum. So, for every job we save, we lose 5 jobs. So that's the history of protectionism, is that you always lose more jobs than you save. And so it's just a formula for, economic failure and job losses.
But even steel and aluminum companies in the U.S. have seen declines in market value since the tariffs were imposed.
Yeah, that's true, and so has Whirlpool. So, again, it's kind of like when you throw these, barriers and distortions into global markets that have these kind of finely orchestrated global supply chains and networks of distribution, and it really is damaging even often for companies that are supposed to be protected. And so that's what we've even seen is some of the steel companies, aluminum companies, Whirlpool, that they haven't really done very well financially or economically, even though they're the ones that are supposed to have been benefiting from Trump's trade war.
When do you think that this is all going to end between, this tariff trade war with China?
Yeah, that's hard to predict. It looks like there's kind of this truce now. I don't know if Trump's going to back down. I don't trust him that he really has any long-term sensible economic strategy. And even the problem with Trump, he's the first authentic protectionist in the White House since the 1920s, as the Wall Street Journal described him. And so even if he was able to get a world of zero tariffs and zero trade barriers, we would still have a trade deficit with the rest of the world because that's just the nature of our economy compared to other economies. So he's still going to be complaining that we have a trade deficit and say we're getting ripped off. So even if we resolve this and move forward next year with, maybe lower tariffs here and lower tariffs in China, maybe this will work out okay. But it just seems like there's going to be a lot of long-term damage, even if we can get this resolved in 2019.
How do you respond to those who say, I'm a market-oriented guy. I agree with you about tariffs and which are just taxes, generally speaking, but there's no other way to impose some discipline and consequences on the Chinese for IP theft, for onboarding the technology developed by U.S. companies. And so there's got to be some repercussions for their bad faith, and this is the only way to impose those consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just the logic of that is kind of flawed, because then what we're saying is we're going to punish Americans and then indirectly try to punish China or get them to, act and behave better. So, but we're going to impose pain and higher cost and job losses on the American economy, hoping that in the end it somehow works out. So, it just seems like if we want to deal with intellectual property theft, that we should do that in a different way, maybe through the World Trade Organization or somehow differently than punishing American consumers and American businesses with the hope that then China will somehow, behave better in the future. It just doesn't seem like that's the right way to do it.
He is Mark Perry, professor of economics and finance at the University of Michigan. Sorry about that Ohio State game. Also, Carpe Diem blogger for the American Enterprise Institute. Mark, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer